the most dangerous transhumanist in the world, outlines the globalist plan to take over, and he's even writing a children's book. Yuval Noah Harari is the voice of the World Economic Forum, and to some, he is the most dangerous man in the world. At least his ideas are the most dangerous. And he's at it again. Wait till you hear about what he has to say the globalists are trying to do to take over the world, how they are trying to rewrite history. And as we said, this madman is writing his own children's book. He's dangerous because he is the front man, the voice for the World Economic Forum and the Davos crowd. He says what they're thinking. And he has the ear of politicians and celebrities world over. He is the one who famously has said that governments and corporations now have the ability to hack humans.
Now, in the past, many tyrants and governments wanted to do it, but nobody understood biology well enough. And nobody had enough computing power and data to hack millions of people. Neither the Gestapo nor the KGB could do it. But soon, at least some corporations and governments will be able to systematically hack all the people.
That the future of humanity is for us to become something different than human. That souls and free will are something that need to be eliminated.
We humans should get used to the idea that we are no longer mysterious souls. We are now hackable animals. Humans are now hackable animals. The whole idea that humans have, they have this soul or spirit and they have free will and nobody knows what's happening inside me. So whatever I choose, whether in the election or whether in the supermarket, this is my free will, that's over. Free will, that's over.
Let me quote that section again to let it sink in. He said, we humans should get used to the idea we are no longer mysterious souls, but are now hackable animals. And he tells us that the change will happen beneath the skin, likely an injected change in genetics, making those who take it less than human.
People could look back in 100 years and identify the coronavirus epidemic as the moment when a new regime of surveillance took over, especially surveillance under the skin, which I think is maybe the most important development of the 21st century.
Now, this is what he has said in the past. Things about how the World Economic Forum and Davos crowd want to transform people into something that is no longer human and thus no longer redeemable by our Lord Jesus Christ. People who lose their right to redemption by changing themselves genetically. But what is he saying right now? Well, he's talking about things that are geopolitical. How the Davos crowd and the World Economic Forum planned to take over. You're going to find it very interesting.
We're going to shift our focus a little bit to geopolitics, these very turbulent times that we're living in, or that we feel we're living in. From a historical perspective, how turbulent are they?
Very turbulent. It feels like we fell off the edge of the cliff, especially given that, the last 2-3 decades have been the most peaceful era, or one of the most peaceful eras in human history. And this is now over. We are in an increasingly turbulent world. And the problem is that we are facing these major challenges that just cannot be solved without global cooperation.
Just like his boss, Klaus Schwab, he recognizes that we are now in the most turbulent times worldwide in history. And just like Klaus, he sees a globalist solution to the problem. What he doesn't say, however, is that maybe there was a globalist cause to these problems. That these aren't just accidental or random problems, but all part of a globalist agenda. But I digress. Now, how does this fit into biblical prophecy? Well, Jesus told us that a time of universal difficulty would precede the Great Tribulation, a time that Jesus called the beginning of the birth pangs. And when we see all these things, deception, war, rumors of war, pestilence, famine, earthquakes, all happening at the same time, then we would know that his return was right at the door, Matthew 24:33. So on this point, Harari does recognize that we're in tough times, but misses the solution, which is Jesus, and misses, or better yet, chooses not to mention the cause. And where does he say all this is leading?
This post comes from an anonymous user, but thank you. They say, how long do you expect the current time of turbulence to continue before we reach a new balance?
I don't think there'll be a new balance.
I was worried you were going to say that.
I think that, as I said, we fell off the cliff. That people, during the corona, there was this constant yearning, when will this be over and we'll be back to normal? And now the impression is we'll never be back to normal. I mean, it's going, the pace of change and also the pace of the crisis is just going to increase. And this is, and psychologically, it's very difficult, especially for people, say, in our age group, because we had the fortune, most of us, to live in a very extraordinary time in history, in the most peaceful, relatively peaceful. There were still some wars. I come from the Middle East, you don't need to tell me. There were also wars in the early 2000s, but generally it was the most peaceful era in human history, and we kind of got used to it. And unfortunately, now it seems that, we build these, peace did not come from the sky, it came from institutions that humanity built. We now neglected these institutions, and the neglect didn't start in Moscow. The neglect started in Washington, in London, the very countries that built the international institutions that created this relatively peaceful and prosperous era. They turned their backs on it. And this is what we get.
To me, this says the globalists plan on causing more and more crises at an ever-increasing rate, so as to force the world into their Great Reset. He blames the USA and Britain, but I think he knows those governments are just puppets that the World Economic Forum is controlling. Here's what he says about the role the Ukraine war is playing.
You wrote in The Economist at the start of the Ukraine crisis that the direction of human history was at stake.
Yes.
Now that 6 months have passed, how do you reflect on that time?
The direction is not good.
I'm not saying it's got any better, but, how
Again,
is it reflecting?
the basic question, it goes much beyond the specific regional war. How are we going to tackle climate change? How are we going to regulate AI if we do not have global cooperation? And global cooperation is disintegrating.
Again, he avoids discussing that the aggressive stand of his association, the World Economic Forum, the UN, and the EU against Russia was a prime motivation in the war. Putin didn't want to surrender his national sovereignty to those guys. And again, Harari stresses a globalist solution, which is a code word for a one-world government, and a takeover by the UN, and of course, his World Economic Forum billionaires. The next quote made me laugh. Harari's original job was as a history professor. And we all know those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it, right? Well, just listen to what Harari has to say now.
Is there a key moment in history that you think world leaders could learn from right now?
History never repeats itself. So it's not like, we can do the same thing we did last time. No, it just doesn't work like that. It's always something new.
Can you believe that? He is now saying that history should play no role in how we plan for the future, that history never repeats itself, which is the opposite of 4,000 years of human culture and understanding. This is what he and his globalist friends would have you believe. It is a rewriting of history so they can get you to do what they want. He then mentions Putin and his knowledge of history. Look at how Harari twists things.
But part of the issue is that as a historian, I'm kind of aghast at the way that world leaders, like Putin, for instance, often use history as a justification for what they do. They live in a fantasy about the past, like that Russia is threatened by Europe. They live it as if it's 1941 or as if it's Napoleon's time. And Nobody in Europe wanted to invade Russia. For all the people who kind of make excuses for the Putin regime, there is a simple question. Which country in 2022 was about to invade Russia? Nobody.
He neglects to mention it wasn't one country threatening Russia, and frankly the rest of the world, but his own group, the billionaire globalists who control the UN, who are now threatening all of us with a one-world government. Putin was the only one to push back. The EU leaders and American leaders are co-opted by these globalists. So when he asks who was threatening to invade Russia, it wasn't with tanks and guns, but rather a political and economic takeover that was planned, called the Great Reset. Russia was the only one to push back against it. This, of course, has played right into the globalist hands as well. Now, this isn't to say that Putin is some kind of good guy. He's a real bad guy. I mean, he's killed tens of thousands. He's destroyed cities. He might even use nuclear weapons. But what we are saying is he sees that the real madmen, the real bad guys, are on the other side, on the NATO side, on the World Economic Forum side, that are trying to take over the world. He sees that, and he's pushing back against it. But he's still a madman. He was then asked about universal basic income, which he assumed we all knew by its abbreviation UBI.
This one says, Yuval, what are the best kind of politics to help us adapt to the future? Is it a free market to incentivize change, or UBI to care for people who are slow to adapt?
UBI I am not in favor of, because the very meaning of the term is problematic. People talk about universal basic income when they actually mean national basic income. If you think UBI means that you tax corporations in California in order to pay a basic income to unemployed people in Pennsylvania, that can work. But who will support the people in Guatemala? Who will support the people in Pakistan? I'm not seeing a US government or a Finnish government taxing its people, its corporations, in order to support the people there. And this is where the big problems will be. So again, we need to think about this in global terms, not in national terms.
First, he acts as if the socialist universal basic income is some sort of good idea. Then he rightly shows that countries will not voluntarily agree to give their wealth to poorer countries. Universal basic income, if it's carried out, will be a very, very low wage, a third world wage. And he then says it will take a globalist solution, of course, a great reset, where all power and money resides in the hands of the billionaires, and they distribute some of it as they see fit, but keep most of it. In the Bible, Revelation speaks of what might be universal basic income. It calls it a denarius. In the Roman world, a denarius was a coin that represented a single day's wage, a universal basic income. During the Black Seal, a day's wages pays for only a single loaf of bread. This is a 10,000% decrease from what the average U.S. citizen receives now. This is what the globalists have planned for all of us. He is then asked about education.
Speaking of which, you are actually working on, you've released a children's book. It's coming out in a lot of different places this autumn. Tell us about that and why you decided to focus on that market rather than the adult market as you have done in your previous books.
Because, children need to understand the world just like anybody else, even more than other people. What I see in many countries is that the education system is focusing on teaching mainly the history of our people, our nation, our culture, which is important, but which is just not enough to understand the world in which we live, not enough to understand yourself. And if you look much deeper in yourself, like our fears, our love, where did it come from? Not from any specific human culture, it comes from millions of years of evolution. So to understand, again, the most basic things about us, who we are, our fears, our emotions, we need a global understanding of history that goes all the way back to human evolution.
Yeah. Fascinating. I'm looking forward to having a look at that and buying that for some of the young children in my world.
This is one of the scariest moments I have had on the internet in a long time. Harari is planning to write a children's book. He is a gay, transhumanist, totalitarian, communist, atheist, evolutionist, and he's telling our children how to live? Imagine the dystopian world that would be. However, I do have a children's book I recommend to you. Jesus and His White Horse by Pastor Jake McCandless. It's available on Amazon, and it's the only book that gives kids a real-world approach about how they should be thinking about their futures. Also notice what else Harari speaks of, deciding what true history was.
So I'll focus on history. This is my field. No point teaching people in school specific information like dates and names and things like that. They can Google it. What they really need is the ability to tell the difference between a reliable source about history and an unreliable source. This is key, not just for understanding history, but also for our politics. Because our politics is all based on historical narratives. And if people can't tell the difference between reliable historical narratives and false historical narratives, we are in big trouble.
They're planning to rewrite history. When asked about the end times, Jesus said, "Don't let anyone deceive you." Matthew 24:4. And that is exactly what Harari desires to do, to teach the globalist deceptive version of what happened in the past. What else has this crazy but influential thinker said? Click right here for a synopsis of his World Economic Forum ideas that are leading this world toward a totalitarian takeover. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.